Amina stood at the edge of what used to be her family's olive grove, her hands trembling as she clutched a photograph of her parents. The grove, once lush with green, had become a wasteland of cracked earth and charred trees, a haunting reflection of her homeland. She was born in Aleppo in 1987 into a modest family of traders. Her childhood was filled with the hum of bazaars, the scent of jasmine, and the warmth of neighbors sharing meals during Ramadan. Syria was imperfect but whole. It was home. In March 2011, the first signs of change appeared. Amina, now a 24-year-old teacher, watched nervously as protests broke out in Dara. She had heard whispers of discontent for years, stories of corruption, poverty, and fear, but never imagined her country could fracture so quickly. Her brother, Tarek, was among the first in Aleppo to join the protests. "We just want dignity," he told her one evening, his voice filled with hope. Amina was proud of him, but fear gnawed at her. She knew the regime's brutality. When the protests reached Aleppo, the government responded with tear gas, arrests, and live ammunition. Amina begged Tarek to stay home, but he refused. One day, he didn't return. Amina spent weeks searching hospitals and morgues, only to find his name scrawled on a prison roster. By 2012, Aleppo had become a battleground. Amina's school closed as neighborhoods fell under siege. Barrel bombs rained from the sky, destroying homes, markets, and lives. She moved to her grandmother's house in the countryside, thinking it would be safer. But the war followed. The rebels and the regime fought for control of the land, while extremist groups like ISIS emerged, spreading terror. Amina's cousin joined the Free Syrian Army, determined to fight for freedom. Her uncle, a loyalist, called him a traitor. The war wasn't just splitting the country, it was tearing families apart. In 2014, ISIS declared its caliphate, and Raqqa became its brutal capital. Amina, like many Syrians, lived in fear of the group. Refugees flooded her village, telling horror stories of beheadings, forced marriages, and disappearances. Her own family's hardship grew unbearable. The Syrian pound collapsed, and food prices soared. A loaf of bread cost as much as a teacher's monthly salary. When her grandmother fell ill, there were no doctors, no medicine. She died in her sleep, one of countless quiet deaths in a nation overwhelmed by louder tragedies. By 2023, Amina had settled in Idlib, one of the last rebel-held areas, working as a nurse in a makeshift clinic. She thought she had seen the worst until the earthquake struck that February. In the chaos, the earth shook with a force that felt apocalyptic. Buildings collapsed like sandcastles, burying families alive. Amina worked day and night, pulling survivors from the rubble, treating broken limbs, and comforting the dying. Aid was slow to arrive, and the government prioritized its own territories, leaving places like Idlib to fend for themselves. "Why does the world let us suffer like this?" a boy asked her one night, his voice trembling with grief. Amina had no answer. Later that year, Amina watched the news on a small, flickering television. Syria had been readmitted to the Arab League. Leaders who once condemned Bashar al-Assad were shaking his hand, calling for stability. She felt a surge of anger. Stability? For whom? The camps around her clinic were still overflowing with displaced families. Children played in the dirt, dreaming of homes that no longer existed. The international aid that kept them alive was dwindling as the world shifted its focus to other crises. Despite everything, Amina refused to give up. Her clinic had become a beacon for the community. She started teaching children during her breaks, using scraps of paper to write lessons on math, science, and history. One evening, a young girl named Layla asked her, "Will Syria ever be beautiful again?" Amina knelt down, holding Layla's tiny hands. "Syria is still beautiful," she said. "Not in the way it was, but in the way we survive, in the way we care for each other." The olive grove where Amina now stood was part of her family's legacy. She had returned to bury her grandmother's photograph in the soil, a symbolic act of remembrance and renewal. Syria's downfall had taken so much from her. Her brother, her home, her dreams of a peaceful life. Yet it hadn't taken her will to fight for what remained. She looked to the horizon, where the sun dipped behind the mountains. The land was scarred, but it was still hers. For Amina and millions of others, The story of Syria wasn't over. It was a story of loss, but also of survival, resilience, and the hope that one day the world would remember them not just as victims of a tragedy, but as people who endured.